I do believe that information technology has changed and shortened the business cycle, but it has not taken it away altogether. It has not made it disappear, either for the creation of new companies or even for the development of new products and services. We can do it much faster, but there is still a business cycle. And I think what happened, particularly to Jake Weinbaum and others, but really to everybody involved in the dot-com boom and bust, was this misunderstanding that just because the public markets thought you could build a company in 180 days, it didn't mean that 180 days was the new business cycle. Now, we've been involved in the IT revolution for about 50 years, and I think it's still a little too soon to start drawing long-term ideas about how long things take and what the real ultimate successes and failures of that revolution are going to be. And so, as I like to do in the classroom, I think it's useful just to take a historical example to get a sense of what kinds of things we can expect to happen, not just in the last 10 years, but for the next 10 years going forward. And the story I like to tell, I think it'll be pretty obvious of why I think it's a good metaphor, is the construction and operation of the Suez Canal in the 19th century. The canal was the brainchild of a French engineer named Ferdinand Marie de Lesseps, and he went around telling people that he had a technology, he had a way of doing something that would make time and distance irrelevant in business. That might sound familiar. That's the same thing that the internet entrepreneurs were saying 150 years later. Of course, de Lesseps' idea was to build a canal through Egypt that would connect the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and eliminate the need for ships, at that point largely sailing ships and then steamships, to go around all of Africa, go around the Cape, and come up the other side. Very dangerous, very time-consuming, and very wasteful from de Lesseps' standpoint. Now, he tried to raise money. He got some private funding. He got some government funding from some of the affected countries, but he was not able to successfully raise enough money to start the project. And so, like internet entrepreneurs, he did what they did, and he went to the public markets before he even started his company. Started raising money through the sale of bonds, and the French, who were driven into a sort of frenzy of nationalism by the French press about this French engineer and the French project, rapidly bought up these bonds, and the Suez stock went through an early speculative bubble, just as many of the stocks that we know of in the last 10 years. De Lesseps got enough money, he started his project, but it turned out that it was more difficult than he thought, and that digging the trenches by hand, even with thousands of unskilled laborers, was taking too long. And so he invented some new technology using the steam engine, a relatively new invention itself. He invented steam dredgers, and even though they were going to make the cost of the project about double its original estimate, they were at least going to get it done. And indeed, in the end, it took him about twice as long, about 10 years instead of 5 years, to build the Suez Canal. And at that point, of course, the investors were getting nervous. Indeed, the French press, his big allies, turned against him. One of the things we learn is that the press can sell a lot more papers taking down an entrepreneur than they can building him up. And so, indeed, de Lesseps became a villain. He found it difficult to continue to raise funds in the last couple of years of the projects, and he was so desperate that he resorted to the sale of what he called, this was a great financial instrument that he invented. If you think derivatives look bad, he invented something he called lottery bonds. And these were bonds. I mean, at that point, the Suez Company the stock was completely worthless. The only way he could raise money was to sell lottery bonds, which were bonds that had a lottery ticket attached to them. And once a month, there would be a drawing for 1 million francs, and one lucky bondholder would get 1 million francs. That's how he actually finished the project. Now, of course, the funny thing is that he did finish this project, even though everybody said it couldn't be done, or it couldn't be done, he was going to go bankrupt. The Suez Canal, as we all know, was finished. And it was begun operation. And yet, in the early years, there was very little traffic. He couldn't find users for his company. Well, why was that? Well, it turned out that there was at least one, if not 2 generations of shipping managers, of captains of ships, and so on, who were so built in to the way in which they did their activities, going around Africa. They knew how to do that. They had the tables, they had the forms, they had the logistics. Perhaps they had friends in ports along the way that they didn't want to abandon right away. And it took at least a generation of those managers, of those captains, to retire before it was able to adjust, the system was able to adjust to the reality that time and distance had become irrelevant, that you could go from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, avoiding all of that hassle, all that cost, and all of that risk. And by the time the Suez Canal actually became profitable, de Lesseps himself had died in prison. He was in prison for some of his financial chicanery that he had to go through to finish building the canal in the first place. The actual canal had been taken over by the British government, which, interestingly enough, had been the most hostile to his project in the first place. They said this could never be done. They said it right up until the day the canal opened. And then when the Egyptian government was going broke, they swooped in, bought up the stock, bought enough of it to become a majority owner, and then they ran the canal profitably for about the next 100 years until it was nationalized by Egypt in the 1950s. In fact, in the first 10 years that the British had the Suez stock, it increased by tenfold in value. It actually started trading above its offering price for the first time and went up to about 10 times what the British paid for it from the Egyptian government. So they were the ones who actually made the money. Now, even today, of course, the canal is still there. And even though most large ships can't use it, it's too narrow and it can't be easily widened, it still generates several $billion in revenue even today, long after, of course, all of the heroes are dead, all of the villains have been punished, and it's still actually operating today. So what's some of the lessons that I take from this? Well, one of them, of course, is, as I say here on the chart, that commercial infrastructure is hard to build. And it's hard not necessarily, although partially, because of technology itself. Technology that de Lesseps used had to be changed in midstream. That's not unusual for very big projects, particularly projects that are trying to build commercial infrastructure. But his real problems were not technological in nature. They were organizational, getting the shipping industry to use it once it was actually there. They were, of course, financial, trying to raise funds for a speculative endeavor that has big potential payoff but lots of risk associated with it. Political issues, trying to manage worldwide governments, particularly when it was a French original project, and there was lots of hostility to the French back then. Of course, we don't deal with things like that now. And cultural obstacles as well, getting those captains to understand that there were new ways of going that could be better, not necessarily for them personally, but certainly for their employer.